Tonight we have 7 stories, from a terrifying story by a former police officer, to stories of monsters, entities, the unexplainable, and more. A huge thank you to all of tonight's writers for allowing me to share their stories. Without them, this video wouldn't have been possible. Remember to send in your story if you'd like to have it featured. You can either submit it at my subreddit, r/slumberreads, or my email you can find in the description. Be sure to drop a like if you enjoy. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. My Uncle Warren worked for my town's police department for 16 years. It's a small town, and it never had that much serious crime in it aside from the meth trade, so he doesn't really have very many crazy stories. One time he stopped a break-in. This other time, he showed up to a domestic spat that turned into a brawl, but nothing really sensational or scary happened to him during his time wearing a badge. Except for that one thing that made him quit the force. Warren wasn't fond of telling anyone what happened. He didn't even tell his wife Janet much. So we sort of dropped the issue and assumed he was just sick of it all. Sick of the crappy pay, sick of the tweakers. That is, until a week ago when he called me up wanting to talk about it. At first I'd forgotten all about the incident until he mentioned he wanted to talk about why he quit the police force. Then all those memories of him being so quiet about the whole thing came back. I asked Warren what got him to change his mind, and he simply said, "If I don't tell somebody, I'm going to lose my mind. But you gotta promise you won't tell Janet." "Fine," I said. "I won't tell Janet. And as far as I'm concerned, I'm still honoring my uncle's wishes because Janet doesn't browse this site. So we worked out a time and place to meet. He'd bring a 6-pack, and I'd take notes. Curious how he didn't want his own wife to find out, yet he wanted this shit written down for posterity. I'm not judging him. I'm sure he has his reasons. I just think it's weird. We met at a motel outside of town. It wasn't a nasty place, but it had seen better days, with the vinyl siding faded from the sun and the pavement cracked. He checked into his room. The lady at the counter, disinterestedly thumbing through an old issue of Field and Stream, as he paid for 3 days in cash. The room itself was pretty shabby. Dusty beige carpet, and a small single bed that smelt of cigarette smoke from its red and white striped sheets down to the mattress. Warren closed the door behind us, and locked it. With a haunted frown on his face, he asked me if I knew why he checked into the motel. I didn't say anything. He said, "It's because I gotta get out of this town for a while. It just feels wrong here, you know?" "What do you mean?" I said, and he sighed and sat down on the mattress, prompting a soft creak from the worn bed springs. "I don't know how much you know about this, but weird shit's been happening more often every year. People seeing things, kids turning up missing in the woods. Whole place feels wrong." As he talked, Warren ran a hand through his thinning hair. I mostly just remained silent, letting him continue. "So you want to know why I quit the force? Do you remember the Baileys?" It took me a minute to pick up what he was setting down. "Oh shit, the family that died?" Warren nodded, taking the first beer from the 6-pack and cracking it open. "Yep, officially their deaths were ruled as suicide, but..." He took a long drink from the can and set it down on the nightstand, wiping his hand on the sleeve of his black jacket. "But I don't believe that's what happened." And so he told me the story. Joseph and Sarah Bailey moved to our town in 1992. Their son Martin was just an infant at the time, and their daughter Hillary was only 4. Joseph worked real estate, and Sarah was a stay-at-home mom, and they seemed like a perfectly normal, happy family at first. That changed in May of 2002, when both Martin and Hillary were found dead in the woods. Apparently the family was on a picnic and Martin had wandered off and fallen in. Then Hillary ran off after him. They were missing for a week before they were found dead from exposure some 2 miles off from where they had gotten lost. We questioned both of them, and they were absolutely gutted by what happened. Sarah was a total mess, blaming herself for everything, while Joseph kept reminding her it was an accident, that it was his fault. Even when everyone knew it was just a tragic accident, they still acted like they had straight up murdered their kids. It was horrible, but there was nothing anyone could do. The funeral came and went, and after a while, Joseph and Sarah seemed to have adjusted. A parent never really gets over the death of a child, but it looked like the Baileys were managing their grief well enough. Though, there was the usual pub talk of Joseph talking to sidekicks, and Sarah looking up weird books, but most of it was treated rightly as bullshit, you know? That is, until the both of them just stopped going out. Around 2006, they showed up in town less and less. They only went out to buy groceries. They stopped talking to people or keeping up with their friends. They didn't even answer their email after a while. It was alarming enough that we got called to do a welfare check on the family in 2008, after the both of them stopped showing up entirely. Shortly after, we were asked to do a welfare check on the Baileys. The station got a call from their own number. Neither Joseph nor Sarah spoke to the dispatcher. It was completely silent save for a heavy, rasping breathing of whoever actually was on the line. Then they hung up after a few seconds. So we go down there, and I could already tell their house was in a sorry state. The lawn was overgrown, looking like it hadn't been mowed in years, with patches of dead yellow grass running along the edge of the lawn close to the driveway. The windows were dusty and dark, with the curtains drawn on all of them. The mailbox was empty, with the lid hanging open. We walked up and knocked on the door, receiving no answer. So we knocked again. We even called out to them, and there was still no answer. After a third attempt, we just forced our way in. If they weren't answering their door, they were either seriously hurt or worse, and we couldn't take a chance on that. On the count of 3, I kicked the door off its rusty hinges, and we all rushed inside. When we saw the interior of the house, we knew how bad things had gotten. The den was strewn with trash, empty chip bags, and soda cans everywhere. The TV was off, with the screen wearing a thin, gray film of dust like nobody had touched it in a long time. There was a bitter, almost chemical smell in the air, and it was so overpowering that one officer had to step outside for a bit and catch his breath. I called out for Joseph and Sarah, once again receiving no answer but the echo of my own voice. The whole house was dark and dusty. It was the first time I had to use my flashlight during the day, in fact. We split up into 2 groups and did a sweep of the whole place. My group searched downstairs, the other upstairs. The kitchen was just as neglected as the rest of the house, with piles of empty dishes in the sink, cupboards full of expired food, and cobwebs. When we reached the parents' bedroom, we were fully expecting to see their dead bodies. With the state of neglect around the place, it was clear to all of us that there was absolutely zero chance of finding either of them alive. Yet, the bedroom was empty. The bed was neatly made. Nothing was missing from any of the drawers or the closet. Where the hell were they? Then I got a call from the upstairs team on the radio. "We found them," he said. "You're gonna want to come look at this. It's fucking crazy." We regrouped at the top of the stairs, and Richardson led us to a room at the far end of the hall. It turned out to be a child's bedroom, or what remained of it. The cloud print wallpaper was covered in these weird symbols drawn with a black permanent marker. Richardson identified some of them as alchemy related, but for the rest of them, he didn't have any idea what they were or meant. Joseph and Sarah were on the floor dead with a blanket draped over them, covering their upper bodies. From the smell and what we saw when we lifted the sheet up, they'd been dead for a few days. One officer walked over to the closet, then turned to face the rest of us. "See if you can explain this." And he opened it to reveal a department store mannequin. The mannequin was painted a glossy black all over, with the same symbols that were on the walls painted in yellow and red all over it. It wore a hand-carved wooden mask, decorated with glued-on beads and feathers, with little strands of hair attached to it in a makeshift wig. Bright green eyes, with black pupils stared out from the mask's eye holes. As if it wasn't fucking weird enough, the mannequin was dressed in articles of clothing from both of the kids. Richardson turned to look at me, and it was the first time I saw that man genuinely scared. "Must be some occult shit," he said. Behind the doll was a crude altar fashioned out of an old desk and decorated with old photos of both children, and more of those runes. Then, we all felt this intense and hateful presence looming over us. Even with the weird shit in this town, none of us expected to see anything like this. An officer took photos of the altar, the doll, the bodies, everything while we collected evidence. I tried to stay in the altar room as long as I could, looking for anything that answered the some 100 questions in my head. But something in that room really didn't want any of us in there. That suffocating presence just bared down on us, not letting up. After a few minutes, my teeth began to hurt, and my whole body began to ache like I spent hours doing hard exercise. Then something fell off the shelf and hit me in the head. I looked down to see a paper folder full of letters, all signed and dated by Sarah herself. So naturally, I read through them, finding that each and every one was addressed to those kids of hers after they had passed away. Each letter described what she and Joseph were doing, how much she loved and missed them, and so on. After a while, I stopped feeling sad for them when I noticed that more and more as the letters went on, Sarah wrote less like the kids were deceased and more like they were simply away. There were even mentions of what they'd do when the kids came home. I saw that exact phrase some 10 times in the same letter. The last letter simply read, "Everything in its right place. Mommy's coming very soon. I'm so sorry it had to be like this." And when I checked the date, it was the exact same day we kicked their door down. I didn't have time to process this discovery when the lights flickered and there was a rumble coming from inside the walls. I don't know how much of this was physically happening, but I've never felt such a hateful force in my life. My head was pounding. My heart was going so fast I could barely breathe. I ran out of that room and urged the others to hurry it up and get out of here, and nobody argued with me. None of us wanted to be in that damned house a second more than we absolutely had to. We took the bodies in, checked the house over before locking it up, and we all got the hell out of there when the work was done. Sometime later, the coroner called the station with the autopsy results. He was certain the Baileys had died of poisoning, but he couldn't find anything in their systems. No arsenic, no cyanide, nothing. However, their livers were twice the size they should be, with congestion in the brain and kidneys. Their hair had been shaved off before death, which reminded me of that awful mannequin and the hair on its head. Did they use their own hair to make that thing? He asked if we'd be satisfied if he ruled it a ritualistic suicide and left it at that. I didn't object, neither did the chief. Sometimes it's best if you just drop the issue. This was one of those times, so it was officially a suicide. The story faded from the news before long, and the whole thing was forgotten. The Bailey's house was bought by a real estate developer and renovated. Another family bought it a few years after. Needless to say, they didn't stay too long. They kept hearing something move around in the house in the night. Their little girl kept seeing a dark shape in her room when she was trying to sleep. Things turning up missing or broken around the house. Shit like that. So they moved out. The house was sold to yet another family who were run off by the exact same things. Right now, that house has been sitting empty for years without a buyer. I don't know exactly what the Baileys were doing, but I think they were trying to bring those kids back and something else. Something really bad came out instead. Even since then, I can't look at this town the same way. I wake up at exactly 4:33 a.m. every night. It's not connected to any special occasion or events. It just happens. Every single night. No matter how hard I try to knock myself out with sleeping medication. I've been to many doctors in the past few years, and they all have absolutely nothing to tell me. I'm perfectly healthy, and their most rational way to explain my strange problem is a nerve reaction occurring every night at the same rhythm. I wake up like every night, but something was different. My room was extremely cold, like someone just had put me into a giant freezer. I stood up, and as my eyes started to adjust themselves to the darkness, I saw my window wide open, my curtains softly swinging with the cold morning breeze that filled my room. I remember shutting my window closed and locking it, like I do every night. Am I crazy? I began to ask myself. Did Grandpa open it while I was asleep? No, that couldn't be the case. I would have been awoken by him, walking up the creaking stairs. In addition to that, he's already a bit insecure on foot, and usually doesn't climb the stairs in case it is absolutely necessary. I was so lost in my thoughts that I nearly forgot that the window was still open. As I walked up to shut it closed, I stopped dead in my tracks. I heard something moving on top of our roof. Footsteps, but not human-sounding footsteps. They were long and carefully taken, similar to a predatory animal trying to approach its unsuspecting victim. I stood still and listened as the footsteps continued on the roof, moving to the east side of our ranch house. Suddenly, my phone began to ring. I nearly got a heart attack as I picked it up from my desk. The display showed no caller ID. Without hesitation, I picked it up and answered the call. "Hello?" I said in a clear voice. Silence on the other end. "Hello? Who is this?" I asked again. When the call was ended from whoever was on the other end, my room was silent again. The footsteps had stopped. I wondered if it could have been some large animal, but there was no rational explanation for any large animal like that to get onto our roof. The rest of the day occurred as any other. The next day I woke up, the alarm clock showing 4:33. I laid in bed thinking of what I should wear to university this day, as the roof over my bedroom started slowly creaking again. Oh no, not again. I was thinking. The footsteps started again, but this time they seemed faster and more aggressive. I just laid back down and put my AirPods in, wanting to just blur the noise out instead of confronting who or whatever that was crawling on top of my house. I started to dress myself at around 6 a.m. and began to walk downstairs to eat breakfast, relieved that I wasn't hearing footsteps anymore. That day, my aunt along with my cousin, who was 6 at the time, came to visit us at our place. After a barbecue in our backyard, we all gathered together in the hallway to say our goodbyes. My little cousin suddenly approached me and handed me a drawing of his. It was a classic drawing a kid that age would make. It showed our backyard with me and the other adults sitting on the table and our ranch house in the background. We all said our goodbyes and my aunt left with my little cousin. I couldn't fall asleep that night, so I took the drawing from my desk and began to look at it with my tired eyes. Something about the drawing was off. It took me a short while to realize it, but there was something in the background. My little cousin drew what seemed like some strange black mass with 6 long spider-like legs, stretched out on all sides, crawling on top of our roof. Strangely, I managed to fall asleep even though it was a very light sleep, after I locked all my windows and doors. My clock, 4:33, as usual. I did my morning routine and went downstairs. I just started to make myself coffee when our home landline started ringing. I picked up, and on the other end was my aunt crying her eyeballs out. After several failed attempts to calm her down, I managed to understand that my little cousin was missing. He hadn't been seen in his bed this morning. After seeing his bedroom wide open, she informed the police and they began searching for him. I'm afraid that his disappearance might have something to do with him seeing and drawing this creature on top of my house. That was 1 week ago, and they still haven't found anything. The footsteps and shoveling noises have stopped for a few days, but this morning they were back, even louder. Today I was awoken by a loud thumping noise. At first I didn't know what the sound was, but then it clicked in my head. I quickly hurried downstairs and yelled for my grandfather. Nothing but silence. I ran into his bedroom and found only a single empty shotgun round laying beside his shotgun on the floor next to his bed. I quickly hurried to the kitchen and dialed 911 on our home landline. No call signal. Someone or something had cut the landline. Then my fight or flight instinct kicked in, and I quickly ran back to my grandpa's room, grabbed the shotgun, and rushed downstairs to my office room. I locked the door behind me and just waited. Somewhere in the distance, a bone-chilling scream echoed from the direction of the forest behind our ranch. Not some scream any human could produce. It almost reminded me of the way an angry mountain lion would scream, just much louder, and so intense that it made the hair on my neck stand up. I had passed for a while, and woke up to the sound of something walking upstairs in the living room. It was then, when I looked up to the clock hanging above the locked door. It's almost 3 a.m. So here I'm sitting now typing this down with shaky hands. I'm afraid that whatever is out there will come back and find me when it gets hungry again. It all started when a young couple, Ian and Susan, moved in with their newborn son to their new home in Northfield Road. It was rented accommodation, and the entrance was a deep red door, which opened onto a steep staircase that led up to the flat. Anti-clockwise from the top of the stairs was the bathroom, master bedroom, living room, then kitchen, after which there was a door that led up to the attic, which came complete with a splendid wall painting of a peacock. They soon settled in, and a couple of years passed without incident, until one weekend when Ian brought his friend Gary home from a night out. A little worse for wear. As was the usual routine, a few more beers were handed around before bacon sandwiches were cooked, and tales of adventures were told. An hour or two later, Gary settled into a makeshift bed on the sofa in the living room, and Ian retired to bed. Around 2 a.m., Gary opened his eyes with a sense of unease. He felt uncomfortable, as if someone or something was watching him. As his eyes adjusted to the dark, he noticed a creepy shadow in the corner of the room. It looked like a man stood motionless. Deep red eyes peered out from its head and stared straight back at Gary. The alcohol in his system made his mind drift off, and he sank back to sleep. At 4 a.m., his eyes opened again. The feeling of unease was back, and, a little more sober this time, he reluctantly turned to look into the corner. Staring straight back at him was the shadow. His mind couldn't quite compute what was happening, and in a semi-sober grunt he uttered, "Piss off," and went back to sleep, feeling a little braver for shouting it. Later, when everyone was up, Gary pulled Ian to the side. "I nearly shit myself last night. Thanks," he said. "What do you mean?" asked Ian. "You, trying to frighten me, stood in the corner of the room," he said. "You must have been there most of the night." "Gary, I didn't even wake up last night. I was out like a lark. Just ask Sue," said Ian. "You must have been drunk." He laughed. The color drained a little from Gary's cheeks, but no more was said about it. Weeks went by with no incidents, and the young family were lulled into a full sense of security. Their little son, Craig, was now running around as toddlers do, and the family felt it was time for him to move into the attic and have his own bedroom. After he'd been settled in a few weeks, Ian and Sue started to hear him getting up in the middle of the night, marching up and down, stomping his feet and generally banging around up there. One night as this happened, Ian decided to go up and settle the lad down, as the banging was particularly loud that night. He could still hear his son marching around as he climbed the stairs up to the attic, but as his head lifted above the banister to look into the room, he could see Craig in his bed, sound asleep. It was at this point he began to suspect the house may be haunted. Craig was moved back downstairs to share the room with his parents, and, although a little paranoid, months went by and the family soon managed to push the idea of a ghost to the back of their minds. Little things kept happening, though. When Craig was playing in the bedroom, they could hear him having conversations. When asked about this, he would say he was talking to the man with the deep voice inside the bed. Another time, when one of Ian's friends came to stay, he went to tie his shoelace and a large hand gripped the back of his head and held it down, leaving him unable to move for a minute or so. He tried to struggle out of the hold to no avail. When the grip was released, he quickly stood up and looked around, only to find no one there. They bought a puppy, thinking it would alert them to any possible paranormal activity. The little black dog was dearly loved by Craig, and he named her Trixie, but this wasn't to last. The poor thing was so terrified that it just howled all night long. After a couple of weeks, it became too much, so the puppy was given away, much to the little lad's dismay. Finally, there was the straw that broke the camel's back. One evening, Ian woke with a start. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and he felt an evil presence in the bedroom. Something very bad was in there. He got up and went to the kitchen where he made a slice of toast to come around. Racking his brains, he tried to come up with an idea as to what it was. There was no rational explanation, so he entered the bedroom again. As soon as he did, the feeling almost took his breath. A feeling of sheer terror washed over him as he walked to the middle of the room. It got stronger as he neared his son's bed. Out of the room, he shot, this time white with fear. He looked into a mirror in the hallway and even pinched his face until it drew blood, desperately making sure he wasn't actually asleep. If he went in and felt this again, he'd have no choice but to get the family out. He nervously opened the door, adrenaline pumping through his veins. This time a black shadow presence hovered over his son's bed near the ceiling, emanating evil. Fear and panic gripped him as he screamed, "Sue, get up now!" He ran over to Craig and hoisted him out of bed, and the three of them ran out of the room. "What is it?" Susan screamed, as they staggered down the stairs to the front door. Ian didn't answer, but as they ran, something jumped onto his back. He shouted out as he desperately tried to shake it off, clawing at his back as the presence wrapped around him. Evil smothered him as they reached the door and fell outside when, just like that, it was gone. Somehow this presence seemed confined to the house and, luckily for them, that's where it remained. As a family they never returned to the property, but Ian sought out the vicar from St. Thomas's Church, who went to the house and blessed each room. Unfortunately, they couldn't gain access to the flat downstairs, which at one point between them formed a whole house before being split. We'll never know if the entity stayed at the house. I say we because my real name is Craig, and my mother and father are called Ian and Susan. It started as a speck in the corner of the ceiling in her living room. Mary thought nothing of it at the time, dismissing it as a random dust bunny or fleck of dirt. She merely grabbed a stepladder, took a towel to it, and moved about her business. When she noticed it the next day, though, it garnered some concern. "Is it mold?" She mused to herself aloud, grabbing the small stepladder so she could reach up to the ceiling again, and lamenting internally that she wasn't tall enough to get close to the speck and examine it. Once again, using a towel, she wiped at the speck. This time she noticed a light gray residue remained. She climbed down from the stepladder, grabbed a spray bottle of Clorox. Back up she climbed, splitting the ceiling and wiping again. Maybe that will help. She muttered to herself as she climbed back down and put the ladder away. 2 days passed before Mary thought to look again, and it was clear that something was wrong. The speck had grown to the size of a dinner plate, and it appeared to be oozing. Grabbing the Clorox and the stepladder, she glanced up at the spot, then down to the floor. A single black blob lay on the floor. Setting the ladder against the wall, she knelt and examined the goo. She poked at it hesitantly with her right index finger and spread it against her thumb. It had an almost greasy consistency, with no noticeable odor. She pulled a towel from her back pocket and quickly wiped what she could of the goo off her fingers. The same faint gray residue she had noticed from the ceiling remained on her index finger and thumb. She grabbed the ladder from the wall and set it up below the spot and, once again, climbed to spritz the Clorox at the offending oozing stain. A faint gray ring remained on the ceiling despite the bleach spray, mimicking the gray residue now on her fingers. She climbed back down the stepladder, folding it, and left it next to the wall, concluding that this may become a daily routine. She crossed the room and into the hall to navigate to the kitchen. She stopped at the sink, looking at her fingers in the daylight streaming in front of the kitchen window. The gray residue seemed to mock her. Bending down, she opened the cabinet below the sink and grabbed an open bottle of Dawn dish soap. Straightening, she mused over the bottle. Advertisements on the television were always showing that baby ducklings could be cleaned of oil residue after an oil spill, so she figured it would cut through the greasy residue on her fingers. She applied a small drop to her index finger and thumb, scrubbing at the residue with her opposite hand and fingernails. She used an elbow to lift the handle on the sink. Water cascaded down in response. Thrusting both hands into the water, she rubbed them together vigorously to wash them and rinse the soap away. Turning off the water with her left hand, she examined her index finger and thumb on her right hand. The residue remained. "That's a tricky stain," she muttered to herself. She turned on the water again, applied more of the dish soap to her fingers. She scrubbed at them vigorously until the skin on her fingers were pink from the friction, then rinsed them. Leaving the water on, she looked at her right hand again. While the skin was pink, the residue persisted. She turned off the sink and stared down at her hand, trying to figure out the next step. "Well, I'll try again tomorrow," she said aloud to herself, trying to push her concern from her mind and continue about her day. That night, as she prepared for sleep, she examined her right hand again. The residue seemed to be increasing in intensity. The light gray of the residue, an almost charcoal color now. A Adjusting her night clothes, she stepped out of her bedroom and down the hall toward the living room. She flicked a light switch on the wall and the overhead light turned on. From where she stood, she could see the spot on the ceiling. Like her hand, the intensity of the spot had increased. She flicked the switch off, making a mental note to call a professional in the morning, and made her way back down the hall toward her bedroom. She climbed into bed, turned off her bedside lamp. As she slept, she dreamt of terrible things, oozing black puddles with oily black hands, and tendrils reaching out at her, whispers in the shadows, a black figure that seemed to always be in her peripheral vision, but disappeared when she tried to look directly at it. An audible scream ripped her from her nightmares, and she jolted upright in bed, her breathing fast and ragged. She reached over and turned on her bedside lamp. Running her left hand through her hair, she realized that she was soaked in sweat. She glanced at her hands and gasped at the appearance of her right hand. Her index finger and her thumb had turned completely black, and it appeared to be spreading across her palm. A sharp pain shot through her hand and she whimpered, clutching it with her left hand. To her horror, the impact of hand on hand made a wet smacking sound. She prodded at the black fingers gently to realize that she could no longer feel sensation in them, and they had a wet, sponge-like consistency. As she lifted her left hand, she noticed they were tinged with an oily black residue, similar to the blob she had cleaned from the floor. No, 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 she muttered, terrified to herself. She ripped the bed sheets off of her and lunged out of bed. Frantically, she made her way down the hall, flicking on the light as soon as she made it to the living room. The stain on the ceiling had grown, and was now larger than a manhole. Thick gobs of black, greasy liquid seeped from the spot and fell onto the floor with audible thuds. She watched as another black blob descended from the ceiling, the audible thwack as it hit the floor, making her gag. Instinctually, she covered her mouth with her right hand and realized her mistake a moment too late. As the spongy fingers made contact with her face, she felt the greasy liquid smear across her cheek. A cry of desperation escaped her. Think, Mary, think, she mumbled to herself, trying to clear her head. The hospital, she thought. The emergency room, perhaps. She made her way back to her bedroom, slid her feet into a pair of sandals, and made to reach for her purse and keys. Stay. The whisper caught her by surprise, and she let out a small scream. She turned in a full circle, looking for the source. Looking back at her keys, she shook her head. You're losing it, Mary. You're cracking up. She took a deep breath and reached for her keys and purse once more. Stay. The whisper came again, louder, with an angry intensity that made Mary shudder and drop the keys. Who's there? She asked loudly toward the dark hallway. She was met with silence. She knelt and picked up the keys, expecting the whisper this time. Stay. Who's there? She hollered back at it, fear and frustration mounting. She waited another moment, expecting more silence. Instead, a sound much like a wet footstep came from down the hall. Mary stared in scared silence. Another wet footstep followed a minute later. If she wanted to leave, she'd have to go down the hall. If she wanted to leave, she'd have to run into whatever was walking toward her bedroom. If she stayed where she was, it would eventually come to her. What do you want? Her voice came out in a thin, scared yell. More silence. Another step. A single teardrop escaped her eye and dripped down her cheek. She wiped at it absentmindedly with the back of her hand, glancing down. What should have been a clear, wet smear on the back of her hand was black and greasy. Another step. It was closing in on her and she felt like a caged animal. She looked at her bedroom window, her reflection showing a black blossom across one cheek and a black smear down another. She crossed the room quickly, keys still in hand, and opened the window. We said stay. The whisper was louder, closer. Mary did her best to ignore it as she reached up with both hands to climb out the window. Her right hand failed her, the spongy consistency causing the fingers to slice open with the pressure in contact with the window frame. Black ooze seeped down the wall from the wounds in her fingers. She clutched at the window opening, sobbing now, frantic to escape whatever unknown horror waited behind her, but failing to find the strength to make the climb. She didn't realize the footsteps had stopped. A black, Tentacle-like tendril slipped over her right shoulder, plunging her side in an icy cold. She watched in horror as it wrapped around her hand and snapped off her dead, black fingers. Mary screamed, rolling around and coming face to face with a black, faceless figure. Another tendril reached for her face, and she slapped it away with her left hand, an animalistic shriek escaping her. Another tendril quickly manifested in its place and stretched toward her cheek. The same cold glacier feeling flooded her face. "Why are you doing this to me?" she asked the figure in a choked sob. Another tendril wrapped around her throat as if in response, and her breath became labored as it squeezed. She stared at the black, faceless head of the figure, her vision narrowing, darkness creeping in. Mary's body went limp as she lost consciousness and slid to the floor. The whirring of machines and a steady beeping noise met her ears. Mary opened her eyes to harsh, bright light and winced. She brought a hand to cover her eyes and was surprised to find an IV attached to it. Sitting up slowly, she groaned and clutched at her aching head. "Oh good, you're awake." Mary looked up to find the face of a friendly nurse smiling at her. "I'll get the doctor." Minutes passed and Mary took in the surrounding hospital room. An oxygen machine sat next to her, its air passing through tubes that were connected across her face, feeding her air through her nose. The IV slowly dripped fluids into her body. A monitor beeped with the rhythm of her heartbeat. The doctor walked into the room, his mouth twisted up in a smile that didn't quite reach his blue eyes. "Glad to see you're awake." He reached out with a hand to shake Mary's, but let it fall when she didn't move. "I'm Dr. Smith. I've been overseeing your care while you've been unconscious. If you're up for the task, I have a few questions I need to go over with you." He pulled a swivel chair close to the bed she sat in. "Where am I?" Mary rasped. She clutched at her throat, remembering the feeling of having her airways cut off. Alarmed, she held up both hands to examine them. All 10 fingers were accounted for. The doctor watched her, his brow furrowed. "You're at St. Bonaventure Hospital. Can I have you state your name and date of birth for verification purposes?" How did I get here?" "Please, before I answer any other questions, your name and date of birth for verification." "Mary Hauser, September 8th, 1982. The doctor scribbled a note onto a clipboard he was holding. "You arrived at our hospital via ambulance 2 days ago. You were unconscious at the time of arrival. A neighbor escorted you during transport. Can you tell me anything that you remember prior to falling unconscious?" "There was this big black thing in the house. I couldn't get rid of it. It just kept growing. I know it sounds crazy, but it attacked me." Dr. Smith quickly scribbled another note on his clipboard. "I don't know that I've ever heard of black mold attacking anyone, but it certainly makes more sense now. Your chronic, obstructive, pulmonary disorder puts you more at risk with black mold. We'll have to run a few more tests to make sure that you're on the mend. We'll need to hold you for a few more days." "Black mold?" Mary looked at the doctor, trying to let his words sink in. Had it all been an illusion? "The important thing right now is that you rest," the doctor said, standing up and moving toward the door. "Let us do the work." He opened the door and looked back at her. "Oh, and Mary?" She looked up, meeting his gaze. "Yes, doctor?" A malicious smile spread across his face, his eyes darkening. "Stay." Like most young high schoolers, my parents wanted me to get a job to earn my own money, and I agreed it was a good idea. Since I love animals so much, I decided it would be a good idea to get a job as a pet sitter. Why not get paid to do something I love? So the next day, I signed up for a profile on a popular website that people use to hire someone to care for their animals or family members. At first, the requests I received were pretty normal. They consisted a lot of, "Hey, could you come by 2 days this week to feed my pet while I go on a work trip?" Or, "We had a family emergency come up. Could you please go by our house to check on our pets?" It all seemed like the usual stuff you would expect for pet sitting jobs. After about 4 months of being on the site and doing jobs for decent pay, I received a request that at first seemed to be normal. It came from a man who told me he was a doctor in my city, and he was taking his family out of the country for a month to visit their family. They were needing someone to care for their cat and dog while they were away, and he offered to pay me very well for my time. He then asked if I would be willing to come over and meet his wife, kid, and pets one day so they could meet me, show me around the house, and what I needed to do to care for their pets. We scheduled a day and time for me to come by, and I prepared my schedule for the coming dates to care for the pets. The day finally arrived for me to go meet the family, and I'll admit I was very nervous. I usually am very excited, but being a doctor, I figured the house would be very nice, and I didn't want to accidentally mess stuff up. I started up my GPS to drive over to their house, and was surprised to find it was close to mine. As I turned into the neighborhood, I saw a house smaller than mine that, to be honest, needed a lot of work. I thought it had to be wrong, but the address matched. I pulled into the driveway and walked up to ring the doorbell, thinking that this was going to be awkward if it was the wrong address. A few seconds later, a small woman comes to the door and is pushed to the side by a huge golden retriever that is very excited to have a guest. She stands to the side and gestures for me to come in without saying a word. I asked if this is Dr. Smith's house, not his real name. She nods yes and gestures again. I walk into the home and immediately notice how dirty it is. There are kid and dog toys everywhere, and the floors are filthy. The house is very small inside, just as I had imagined it would be, and does not have much furniture. As I'm looking around the house, my attention is immediately pulled to a large cat coming into the living room, who is fluffy and beautiful. I reach down to pet it, and immediately it runs downstairs to the basement by squeezing between a hole in the baby gate blocking the stairs. A few moments later, Dr. Smith walks into the room holding a small child, then introduces himself, his child, and the quiet woman who he addresses as his wife that does not speak English. In my head, I immediately think if she doesn't speak English, how did she understand when I asked if this was your house? But I quickly dismiss this thought and continue listening. He shows me around the upstairs of the house, where to find pet food, leashes, toys, and anything I might need for cleanup if one of them has an accident in the house. He tells me they will be leaving Monday, and then gives me a piece of paper with a schedule printed out on it for feeding and walking times, as he walks me to the door and asks me if I have any final questions. I remember he asked me to clean the cat litter box, so I ask where it is. Slowly he stops mid-stride, inhales sharply and says, "The litter box is downstairs through that child gate over there. Go down the stairs, first door on the right. You will come to the first storage room. Enter this room, and on the right you will see a passage into the next room. This is where the litter box will be. There is no light in there, so make sure to turn on the one in the first storage room. Oh, and one final thing. Only clean the litter box on Wednesdays. Do not for any reason clean it on Tuesday or Thursday. It will mess up the schedule." I immediately found that to be weird, but maybe they had some schedule set out for the cat, or another caregiver that I was just filling in for. He then continued to walk me to the front door and make sure I had everything I needed to start that following Monday. After that meeting, I went home and told my parents about my job. I would be starting the following week, so they knew my schedule and where I was. I found the situation to be strange because their house was so small and dirty for the type of lifestyle I would expect from a doctor and his wife, but maybe they use money to pay for other important things. I just couldn't see from the outside, so I dismissed it. Monday came and went. I checked on the pets with no issues and made sure they had everything needed until I could come back the next day. On Tuesday, I decided to take a more detailed walk through the upstairs of the house and look closer at pictures to see if I could understand them better. One thing I noticed is his wife was never smiling in any of the photos they had. She always looked very sad or serious and wore dull, loose-fitting clothing. I went into the kitchen next, and as I looked closer I noticed things had name labels. The more expensive organic food had Dr. Smith's name, while the cheap, unhealthy snack foods all had his wife's name on it. After I finished the pet's care for the day, I went home with a lot more questions in my head now than the answers I had hoped for. On Wednesday, I came over to do my usual care for the pets, and as I was getting back from walking the dog, remembered on that day I was supposed to clean the litter box. When I got back and put everything away, I grabbed a grocery bag and poop scoop, then prepared for my journey to the basement. I remembered when the doctor told me about this, how it was weird he only gave me verbal instruction and didn't take me downstairs to show me where to go. I went to the top of the stairs and unlatched the baby gate. As I am preparing my descent, the cat immediately bolts past me, about knocking me off my feet, and takes a sharp left instead of a right at the bottom of the stairs where he told me to go for the litter box. I begin heading down and get to the bottom where I am greeted by a closed wooden door on my right. I look to the left where the cat ran and see a big living room full of women's clothes and boxes, but no cat in sight. I open the door to the storage room on my right and immediately feel for a light switch on the wall, but with no luck, I pull my phone out and find a string hanging from the ceiling, so I pull it and the room begins to light up. As I step back, I take a look around the room and immediately notice a big, nasty stained mattress laying in the middle of the floor with sheets thrown on it. Surrounding it are a table, some tools in a toolbox, and cabinet on the wall. I look to my right to see a passageway into a dark room, which is where I assume the litter box room he referred to is. A little creeped out by what I see in the first room, I'm not excited about going into the next one, especially since there is no light. I make my way to the passage and pull out my phone. As I shine it around the room, I spot a water heater, boiler, and air conditioning unit. Then at last the litter box next to the water heater on the floor. As I make my way over to the litter box, I get this sense of being watched and then feel goosebumps start to form and the hair rise up on the back of my neck. I have always been creeped out by basements, so I try to power through it, but as I am cleaning the litter box, I hear what I can only describe as a shoe sliding across concrete beside me, behind the water heater. I pull my phone flashlight up closer to my face and look in the direction of the water heater as I am squatting down scooping litter, and I am immediately met with two green eyes staring directly back at me. Eye level. I immediately drop the scoop and bag, then take off running for the exit. As I am running, I hear shuffling and boxes crashing down behind me. I run past the first storage room and take a sharp left straight up the stairs. As my foot hits the top step, I hear theirs hit the bottom and pick up pace so I can run straight to the front door, grab my keys off the table, and get out of there. Leaving everything open and unlocked, scrambling to get in my car, I start it up and do not see anyone follow me outside. I speed out of the driveway, call my parents as I head straight home. My dad is waiting outside, who tells me to hop into the truck, that he wants to go back over there. I tell him he is crazy. There is no way I'm going back, but he insists. As we pull into the neighborhood, I notice two cars in their driveway now. I do not know what the owners drive, as the cars were in the garage, and I was not taken out there. When we get closer, my dad stops the truck and we see the husband, wife, and a man walk out of the house arguing with each other, and they were not supposed to be back for a month. The guy leaves in one car with the wife, and the husband stays behind at the house. He goes back inside and walks back out, locks the front door, gets in his car and drives off. We called the cops to tell them what happened, and they said that when they went by, nobody was home. A couple of weeks later, we get a call from the police department asking us for more information on the family and my conversations with them. After giving printouts of everything I had, they proceeded to tell us that house was vacant. No one had lived there for a year, and when they finally got the owner of the property, who doesn't live in this state, to show them the house, it was completely empty, just as they said it had been for the past year. Needless to say, I quit pet sitting after that. But about a month later, I got a letter in the mail at my house with no return sender. It had $500 cash inside, and a note that said, "Thank you so much for caring for our pets while we were away. We hope to work with you again soon." I'm writing you to share an experience I had with what I believe to have been a life form not of this earth. I know, this sounds like a tall tale concocted around a smoky campfire in order to scare small children, but believe me, a tale such as this, if it were farce, would have been crafted with greater embellishment. First, let me start off by saying that I am just an ordinary person. I'm married, have 3 children, and I'm currently a substitute teacher. I'm a former police officer and veterinary tech. I am a well-rounded, faith-based individual. Hopefully I have established somewhat of a picture of my credibility, because what I'm about to tell you sounds completely illogical, and totally fabricated if not by a creative storyteller, and most definitely a mentally wayward individual. But let me assure you, the night it happened, and for many nights after, it was very real to me. 1996. I was 18. I'd moved in with my fiancé into a 2-story home that was located in the country, surrounded by retired cornfields. The nearest house was over 2 miles away. The only way you could find our place was to know where it was. Those winding dirt roads were easy to get turned around on. It was around 11 p.m. on a breezy yet balmy Texas summer night. I had been outside most of the day and couldn't sleep because of a horrific sunburn from head to toe. The hours leading up to my trip downstairs were spent trying to balance the cool of a window unit and the sting of my skin. I finally succumbed to the pain and tightness of my red skin and hobbled downstairs to take a cool bath. I found that the cool water only exacerbated my pain. Irritated, I toweled off and wrapped a bedsheet around my body. The inside of the house was rather stuffy. It was a much older home. It didn't have central air conditioning. Given the extent of the burn on the back of my legs, I wasn't ready to make that painful climb back up the stairs quite yet. Irritated with my failed attempt at getting relief, I decided to step into the front porch to enjoy the breeze. As I stood there, I began to feel very uncomfortable. Not the someone is watching me uncomfortable, but rather the I caught someone staring at me and we made eye contact uncomfortable. The front yard was made up of a small carport in which 2 vehicles were parked. A street light stood next to the carport and it illuminated the entire yard. I scanned the yard searching for whatever it was that was unnerving me. My instinct for fight or flight was delayed because I couldn't see what I was reacting to. I could only feel it. Just as I decided to retreat into the house, I turned halfway toward my left, eyes still scanning. Then I saw it. A figure stood, appearing half crouched, as one would when attempting to hide from someone, between the 2 vehicles, toward the bumper area, as we always pulled straight in, under the carport. Now the light didn't fall into the carport, but illuminated the surrounding area. But the lights reflecting off the cars and what little light shone through the roof of the carport did give off just enough light for me to see it. I stood there in shock, frozen in fear, and with my mouth agape, tried to rationalize the large head and unnaturally narrow neck while simultaneously attempting to register what I was looking at. Your mind has a way of flipping through everything you have ever seen in your life in order to place such a sight into its proper category. I had nothing. I took one step forward to try and focus my already straining eyes on its features when it abruptly ducked between the cars. And let me add, nothing, not a single person or thing I have ever seen has ever moved that fast. Ever. That is what sent my adrenaline reeling. Not so much the bulbous misshapen head and neck, but at that unfathomable, impossible speed it moved. I ran inside, trying desperately to find the courage to scream. I found my voice just as I rounded the bottom of the staircase. My fiancé woke up with a start, and I did my best to tell him what I saw through hot tears and uncontrollable sobbing. He grabbed a pistol and went outside. Me begging him not to go, I stayed at the top of the staircase and cried. I cried because I was scared. I cried because there was no way that I saw what I did. I cried because I felt absolutely and utterly insane. He found nothing. Nothing at all. I didn't sleep that night. I realize how this sounds, like the ravings of a mad woman, even being the one who lived it. I still question myself at times and wonder if this really did take place. But let me assure you, this really happened. Ever since the app came out, I've loved Snapchat. I send snaps of my daily life to all of my friends, and while I like the idea of the story feature, nothing beats getting a personal response from all my friends when I send them little jokes or stories from my life. While this may sound pathetic, I started working 3rd shift recently, which means I don't have a lot of time to see my friends, since I'm asleep while they're awake, or I'm awake and at work while they're asleep. Yeah, it's a dumb app, and the little 10-second pictures can't replace human interaction, but in my current position, it fills that void just enough to make me feel a little less alone. I wake up Saturday morning, more like 6 in the afternoon, but morning doesn't mean much anymore. and the first thing I do is grab my phone to shut my alarm off. After I shower, brush my teeth, and finish all the other little rituals we do in the morning, I make a quick breakfast of eggs and toast. I take a snap of the eggs once they're made, and send a snap with a timestamp on it, aware how odd it will be for people to see I'm eating breakfast towards the evening. I chuckle to myself, knowing it's not funny or clever, not even a joke really, but sending it all the same. Almost instantly, I get a reply. My friend Henry, who never normally replies to snaps unless they're questions, already sent me a return snap. I'm a little confused, but open it anyway. Henry is sitting in his living room, a finger over his mouth, his eyes almost bugging out of his head. He looks exhausted and terrified. And as I notice these details, I start to read the thin line of text he sent with the picture. It's coming for you today. Weird. I dismiss this easily, since Henry almost never snaps me anyway, and either meant to send this to somebody else, or was just playing a weird prank on me that I wasn't in on. I ate my breakfast, wondering what to do with my day, or night, off. Since everybody in town is gone for the weekend, I settle on smoking a bowl of weed and playing video games. I turn the lights on in my basement and light my bowl. As soon as I take my first inhale and cough, my phone buzzes. I open it to see a notification from my ex-girlfriend, Samantha. We parted on good terms and still talked all the time. I smile a little and open the snap. She sat in the same position as Henry, eyes bugged out a little, finger over her mouth. The only difference in this snap was I recognized her bedroom walls. A line of text was there, and I looked down to read it. It's coming for you today. At this point, the first hit I took is kicking in, along with the paranoia it can bring. I switch to the phone app and call her, but she doesn't pick up. I hang up after I get the voicemail memo, snap her back. I look angry in the picture, and a little baked, but added my line of text asking if she'd been talking to Henry. After I get to my room, I decide to look at my snap history to see how many people have opened my snap from earlier. As I do, I notice I have several unopened snaps from my friends. My Wi-Fi is shit, so my phone must have not registered the notifications. I open about 10 snaps from friends, and each one fills me with more and more dread. All of them are the same. My friends using the front-facing camera, finger over their mouths, looking terrified with their eyes bugging out. It's coming for you today. The sentence is burned into my mind. Even as I close my eyes, the combination of the situation and the high is causing a headache, and I take a few deep breaths to try to calm down. I sit in silence for a little before my phone buzzes again. I look and see a new member has added me on Snapchat. I don't recognize the name, but the app says they added me by my own username. I see 2 friends have sent me snaps since this new person added me, but I ignore them and accept the invite. I hear a knock on my door, but since it's late and everyone I know is out of town, I ignore it. I have more important things going on at the moment than a door-to-door salesman or lifeless Jehovah's Witness. I snap the new person and ask what's happening. This is either some elaborate prank, or this is all connected. The new person sends a reply almost immediately. I hesitate, but open the snap. The screen is dark, but I can make out a faint outline of a person in it. Finger against their lips. My eyes roll down to the line of text present, almost popping out itself among the dark background. It's here. The message just registers in my head when I hear my front door shatter. Hey everybody, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I didn't quite have enough to make the full hour, so I'm going to do one of my little rambles at the end that I do occasionally, usually when I don't make the hour-long deadline. And that's alright, you know, I can't hit it every single time, right? As you guys have noticed, I've gone back to the hour-long uploads. I thought it would be fun to test the 2-hour-long videos, and I decided that they're a little bit too draining, if I'm just being honest. Even though I was only posting every 4 days, it's like I'm making you guys wait longer for something that is even more draining for me to make. Whereas these hour-long videos are just always a blast. I have a ton of fun just sitting down late at night, recording for an hour, hour and a half, somewhere in that ballpark, and then editing everything down and hitting that render button and just anticipating you guys enjoying it. That's the way that I have found is best for me. Right now I'm doing every other day. I plan on keeping that schedule as long as I have content to upload. If I don't have enough stories, then of course, it might be 3 days between a video or 4. Hopefully never 4, but it can happen. I also want to say we're getting really close to 70K. I'm really excited for that. It's always cool to hit another milestone because I never know when it'll be my last milestone, and we seem to just kind of keep growing. I'm not the biggest channel out there. I'm not the most recognized. I'm not the most known. You're not going to go down the street and be like, oh, hey, are you subscribed to Slumber Reads? They're going to have no idea who you're talking about. But I find that to be kind of a really cool aesthetic about this channel. It's like you either know about it or you don't. I think that's pretty much it. I hope you guys enjoyed the video once again. It was definitely a pretty interesting lineup this time around. You know, I always try to make them as interesting and as entertaining as possible, but this one was a little bit different. But yeah, it's currently almost 1 in the morning. So again, I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will talk to you guys later. Good night, everyone.